So, I have a number of things that I'd like you to think about as I go through my comments today. One is how people learn, right? So that in philosophy you call that epistemology. And I find that the development of the self, the theory of learning is very, very important. And it's not just the sort of Western theory of learning. I've taken a lot of instruction from non-Western theories of learning, specifically the Songhay theory of learning. And the Songhay theory of learning goes something like this. When you are young, if you're learning a specialization like a weaver, or a craftsperson, or a griot, a storyteller, or a sorcerer, when you're young, your mind is not seen as ready to learn important things. So when you're young, you learn the nuts and bolts of your craft, whether it's weaving, whether it's sorcery, whether it's learning praise poetry as a griot. And then, if you pass the test, if you learn enough epics, you learn enough incantations if you're a sorcerer, then you move on to the next stage where you're kind of a master in a sense. You know enough to practice what you've learned to a limited extent, but you're always under the tutelage of an elder, right? The elder is always there, overlooking and judging what you're doing. And so let's say you move through that middle period of learning. You're always learning. You never stop learning. You move through the middle period, and you meet all the tests, and you age. And the Songhay believe that the mind expands with experience, and only when the mind has expanded with experience over time is it ready to receive powerful information and powerful knowledge. So by the time you're around 60 or so, if you're still around and you're an elder, then you are said to be a master of whatever you are: master sorcerer, master griot, master musician, master weaver, whatever it is. And then you can practice. You practice your craft, you practice your science, your knowledge. But your most important obligation is not to practice what you have learned over a long period of time. Your most important obligation is to pass your knowledge on to the next generation, to mentor people who are younger than you, mentor the next generation of learners. And that is your sacred and most important obligation. So I take this to heart myself in my own work, and I find in the development of my sort of anthropological self, I learned nuts and bolts of anthropology, and I'll talk more about this in a moment. But I see myself now as more or less an elder. I see myself as my major responsibility is to talk to people who are learning history, anthropology, whatever, and to try to present them information that will help them on their own path, to convey the knowledge that I have accumulated over almost a lifetime of work to you, and have you do with it what you will. Hopefully it will guide you in fruitful directions in your own intellectual journeys. So this is a kind of slow learning, right? So there's, maybe you're aware of the move. There's a slow food movement, right? Maybe you know about that. And then there's a new book out called Slow Professor, right? And these are people who are objecting to the sort of rapidity, the sort of the bureaucratization, the corporatization of the university. And so these folks, the Songhay would say that's probably a pretty good idea, right? So I'm an advocate of slow learning and slow development over time. So I mean, in anthropology, one of the great anthropologists was Alfred Kroeber, who was a student of Franz Boas, who was the founder of American anthropology. And it was at Alfred Kroeber's defense in 1912 and 1913, Boas sort of patted him on the shoulder and said, "Okay," and he had put in like a 700-page dissertation, a fantastic piece of work. the boa says, well, okay, welcome, you know, it's great that you did this, but this is just the beginning, right? You have much, much more to learn. You have much, much more to refine. You take the slow course and develop your ideas over a long period of time, and eventually your mind will ripen, and you will produce memorable work that will make a difference in the world. So that's one thing I want you to think about. The second thing is when you approach material, I think it's important to be flexible. That is to say, don't be afraid to change your orientation. Now, if you are presented with material that challenges the sort of received wisdom of your training, it's important to understand that, but it's also important to be able to say, well, you know, maybe it's, what if I do this? Or what if I do that? That creates a kind of spark of creativity, which is important in any kind of intellectual endeavor. And it creates what I like to call existential openness. So when you're living with material, whether you're doing field work or you're working in an archive, living with material, it's important to sort of open yourself to that material, live with it, and let it speak to you. That sounds kind of mystical, but let it speak to you and guide you in, you know, if you do that, it's likely to guide you in a fruitful direction. So keep that in mind as I'm talking. And then finally, the importance of narrative. I want you to think about narrative. Narrative is important for historians. It's certainly important for ethnographers. Ask yourself the question: why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I doing anthropology? Why am I doing history? Why am I doing Middle Eastern studies? What's the reason for my doing this? Right? It's not an easy question to answer. So what's the reason? Why am I doing this kind of thing? You know, and for me, I find it. I take what I do. You know, I take a humorous approach to what I do, but I take it seriously in the sense that I think that every scholar has an obligation. When you take on, when you study something like history or anthropology, you have an obligation to the world, and that obligation is to contribute knowledge that hopefully will lead to some degree of wisdom, and you know, with the classical definition of which is knowledge that's produced that makes life a little sweeter, makes life a little better for people. Classical obligation of scholars. So keep those things in mind as I go through my my spiel. All right, so there is. I'm going to start off with narrative. There is a great American writer named Tim O'Brien. I have this in the abstract that I sent you guys. And he wrote a book about the Vietnam War called The Things They Carried. It's a fantastic book. It's about memory, really. It's about how people remember things, ultimately. And he says, at one point in the book, he says, stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for an eternity. When memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. So I'm going to try to talk today a little bit about how my experience in the world has propelled me towards story and storytelling. And my mentor, and it's always important to find mentors, my mentor was the filmmaker Jean Rouch, French filmmaker Jean Rouch. And he always used to say, you know, if there is no story in what you're doing, then what is there? So, and the reason that stories are so important is that it connects people. Stories connect writers and readers, filmmakers and their audience. It connects people. Whether you're writing the story of history, whether you're writing the story of the ethnographic story of a group of people, or you're telling someone's tale, it's a way of creating connections in a world that is often severed of connections. So it's a really kind of important thing to do, at least in the way that I view the craft of scholarship. So let me talk a little bit about my own anthropological self and its development. So like most graduate students, I was trained, in a discipline. In my discipline was social anthropology. And I was taught to do empirical investigations of disciplinary importance, right? So how do you do that? Well, if you're writing a proposal and seeking funding, you want to find a quote-unquote problem in the literature that has some theoretical importance, right? So, and if you're able to find that and present a proposal demonstrating the theoretical significance of what you want to do, and submit it to a funding agency, maybe they will give you money to do what you want to do, which is always a good thing. And by and large, so everyone, in at least anthropology, in the development of their anthropological selves, goes through this process of writing a research proposal that's focused on these theoretical issues, and you have to be current and sophisticated and all of that. And then once you get, say you get funded, and you get to do your field work, you go to a place like Niger or wherever you're going to go, you realize that very little of what you prepared for, very little of the theory that you described, or the plan that you put in your research, very little of it is relevant because the situation is never what you anticipate, right? Because you're dealing with human interaction, you're dealing with human beings, human relationships, and they don't necessarily reduce themselves to some kind of abstract principle. So when you are being there, doing the field work, you realize that what you're doing is highly subjective, and you have to sort of adjust to a different set of circumstances, right? And then when you return to your institution, where you receive your training, where the institutional principles of whether it's history or anthropology, they vary from discipline to discipline. When you're there, your committee members tell you, okay, well, let's put your information into a coherent whole, right? So in anthropology, it means you write an introduction, you present your data, which, the introduction spells out the theoretical significance of your work. You have your data, and then you have your conclusion, and there's a lot of, as one of my favorite sort of dry anthropological spirits, a guy named David Sapir used to say, and in between you have a lot of procrustean bedmaking. So you fit things in, right? And you want to have a neat package, right? You want to have a nice beginning, nice middle, nice conclusion, all into a neat little package. That is a powerful argument where you have logic, A following B, following C, following D, etc., etc. And then once you do that, you do your dissertation, and your idea is to write up the results of your scholarly articles in scholarly articles once you finish your PhD, or write monographs using the same set of criteria. My field work in the Republic of Niger was on sorcery and spirit possession. So I lived with practitioners, sorcerers, and priests of spirit possession cults, witnessed hundreds of spirit possession ceremonies, participated in sorcerers' rites, etc., etc. Was an apprentice to my teacher over a 17-year period. And then in that experience, I witnessed things that I could not explain, and nothing I read could explain. Right? People speaking in tongues, speaking languages they had no association with, people handling fire and not getting burned, eating poison plants, and not getting sick. Weird stuff. And I didn't know how to explain it. But when I returned to my institution, being here, I was told to transform that data into a monograph that makes a contribution to our knowledge about sorcery. Right? So I produced a first draft of my book on sorcery, In Sorcery Shadow. The first draft was nothing like what you read. Nothing like. It was an introduction. It had presentations of data, all sorts of theories, anthropological theories on sorcery, presentations of data, and then a conclusion. A neat little package with a very well-made Procrustean bed. So I said, I developed this very personal relationship with my teacher, Aviv was his name. And I said, okay, maybe I should take this book and tell him what I've written about him. Tell him what I've written about Sorcerer. And so I went to Niger, and I spent 4 months in his compound, and every night, he didn't want anyone to hear what we were talking about. So every night I'd go to his little straw hut, and he'd light a little kerosene lamp, and I'd translate my book into Songhay. And we'd do it, you know, he was an old guy at the time, he was in his 90s. So he said, well, maybe after 3 or 4 pages, he said, okay, that's enough. I'm going to go to sleep, right? Come back tomorrow. So I come back the next day, and the next day, another 4 or 5 pages. So it took me 2.5 months to translate this book to him. He never said a word about what he thought. And then at the end of the time, I was going to leave the next day. I said, Baba, I said, I translated this whole text to you, and you haven't said a word to me about what you think. I'm leaving tomorrow. Please, I was so nervous. Tell me what you think. And he said, well, it's not so good. It's not so good. And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean it's not so good? And he said, this is what I'll quote you. He said, there isn't enough of me in it, and there's not enough of you in it. And then he said, and this sort of framed all of my future writing. He said, is it a story that my grandchildren and your grandchildren will read and discuss? Wow. And I said, well, I don't think so. So that has been my writing challenge in anthropology as an anthropologist. How to craft a text that remains open to the world. A text that has legs that my grandchildren and their friends might one day read and discuss. So, will I succeed in this mission? Well, maybe here and there, maybe not, but it is a challenge that I think we all should take seriously. How long do, so I tried to do that over this 35-year period. I wrote essays, and I'm sure my essays, my grandchildren, knowing them, you're not going to ever want to read my essays. It's not cool enough to read them. But my ethnographies, maybe. I've written a biography, maybe they'll read that. And I stumbled on the slippery slope of memoir. And memoir is a difficult thing to write because it's very easy to slip into a memoir being too personal. If a memoir is too personal, most of us think we're really interesting, but we're not really as interesting as we think we are. So, and the people we write about, or the period of time in history that you write about, are much more interesting than us. So it's very easy to slip over that. So the best memoirs are those that are where the writer uses her or his experience to write about something larger, larger social issue, right? And my rule of thumb in writing, is to let the nature of the material shape the texture of the work. All right. So in my writing, I've written about a lot of different things, and the genre that I chose, I tried to fit it with the material. So spirit possession, which is very complex and sort of operatic, and it's very theatrical, lots of characters. I've used ethnography to sort of describe that. When I've written about diaspora, I've used ethnography, and I've also used fiction to write about diaspora. The anthropology of the census, which I've written about, I've used academic essays. My grandchildren will never read that, I can guarantee you. Sorcery, I've used memoir and fiction. And no matter what I've done, I've tried to foreground narrative in some fashion, right? And so, and especially more lately, after having myself experienced serious illness, I felt that it was really important for me. A lot of what I was talking about before was to try to transform my knowledge of anthropology into deep narrative memoir and fiction storytelling. Right? So So my latest attempt to do that has been, so I've written fiction, and maybe we can talk later about the pros and cons of doing that. But so I'm going to read a short, I don't like to read when I do these things, but a short little passage. I've got some funny comments on my trying to pitch a novel to an agent. All right, so my point is I've got a novel, I don't know what to do with it, right? I want to tell this story about sorcery, and I feel it's a way of getting into the sort of deep dynamics of the interpersonal relations of sorcerers and the history of sorcery and all that sort of thing. And so I wrote a synopsis for agents, and when you write to a fiction agent, you're supposed to do it in 1 page, 3 paragraphs. 4 paragraphs, they won't read it. 2 pages, they'll throw it away. So my synopsis is this. It's becoming increasingly difficult to understand the world, especially for a rapidly growing number of people who live in 2 cultures, who live in 2 worlds. Omar Dia, the protagonist of The Sorcerer's Burden, which is the title of my novel, is one such person. He is an esteemed professor of comparative literature at the Sorbonne. He is married to a French physician and lives with her children and his 2 children in an upscale apartment in the Bastille in Paris. At the end of the first part of the novel, which describes Omar's life in Paris, he receives a phone call from his brother announcing the approaching death of his father, a renowned sorcerer who lives in a compound of mud brick huts situated on a sand dune in Tilbury, Niger, the poorest nation in West Africa. As the oldest son of a great sorcerer, it is his obligation to return home to a destiny that he has avoided his entire life. With great trepidation, he leaves his family in Paris and goes to sit with his father during his dying days. And in the second part of the novel, Omar settles into the slow, rustic routine of the family compound, very much missing the comforts of home. Late at night, his father reveals to him the great family secrets, the formula of magic potions, the secrets of divination, the ability to break a curse, the capacity to repel death magic. Surprising himself, Omar Dia, professor of literature, learns to like the life, full of prestige and power, he finds on the sorcerer's path. Omar is with his father when, in the final moment, the great sorcerer vomits a small metal chain onto his chest, the material manifestation of his power. Following the path of the ancestors, Omar swallows the chain, becoming his father's successor, which means that he takes on the sorcerer's burden. The dramatic tension of the novel, which is written, at least in my view, in clear and unencumbered language, stems from Omar's existential attempts to reconcile his life in France and Niger. In the third and final part of the book, which I will not tell you about, Omar ingeniously finds a way to meet his obligations without compromising his intellectual achievements, or neglecting his responsibilities as a sorcerer. In so doing, Omar shows us how to live well in the world. All right, so that's my pitch. Right? This is the reception I got from agents. That's my anthropological self trying to pitch a thing to people who are in the world of fiction, which has another definition of self. Senior agent. Most prominent agents, maybe you're lucky if they read 75 pages of your book. They're not going to read the entire manuscript. So here's a senior agent, very, very powerful agent, who agreed to read, like my synopsis. This is her. This is a tough call. Oh, I'm in trouble already, right? If only because your knowledge of the world, both of Niger and that of immigrants in France, is so spot on. I'm in real trouble now. And extensive that alone makes for intriguing reading. And the dilemma your protagonist faces, integrating 2 worlds in his divergent sense of self with these disparate cultures, is itself pretty compelling. But despite my admiration all around this, my final decision is that the novel is not there yet. And so it would be premature to commit to taking it on. This is a novel where so much hangs on the portrayal of Omar and the reader's connection. As of this reading, I don't feel he's as fleshed out as he needs to be for the reader to get into his skin. I feel the novel needs to be less intellectual, oh God, and a lot more visceral, dripping with emotion, I guess, for the book to have the kind of impact you're looking for. Years back, and here's a real killer, years back I might have taken this on and worked with it on you, but the US market is so difficult now that given this a more small list, offering advice for revise is about the best I can do. Thank you so much. A junior agent. It doesn't get any better, believe me. This guy's a real hotshot. Read much of your book already. And I wanted to be in touch. Fact is, I think the idea, the setting, the story is really awesome. Actually, really interesting and different and intense. But if I'm honest, oh boy, I think that there are a few problems that become big issues for me. I think Omar's tone is meticulous and perfect, but he speaks the same way as he thinks, which is dry and lacking of emotion. And then everyone else speaks the same way, polite and careful, and feels like there's only one voice all the way through, which is pretty hard for me. This guy's never been to Africa, he doesn't know how people speak. If the dialogue had more spark to it and more interactiveness and individuality, I think the book could be really, really great. I know this is me, but others might think differently, but I tell you, I don't write comments like this unless I think there's merit. Thank you so much. So good luck with it, Paul. Okay, thanks. All right, one more, and then, Dear Paul. That's like Dear John. Thanks so much for your patience as I considered your novel. I'm always honored when Charlotte and Meredith, who are two very senior people, who said, oh, you take it. Let me give it to you, right? Pass along a project to me, as it almost certainly is impressive. Your novel is no exception. I'm afraid that I'm just not the right agent for it. I don't know why they passed it on to her. I specialize in children's literature, and though I'm also looking for novels that may appeal to 20-somethings or Generation X or Y, this isn't quite what I'm looking for. It seems to touch on themes that will be appealing to young adults, though it is clearly an adult novel. I would just wouldn't know how to pitch it. You're obviously extremely talented, and so I hope this email isn't discouraging. It is. I would recommend querying more agents who handle adult fiction if you have not already done so. Thanks again for sharing this, and I wish you great success. So you know, that is trying. You know, there's a different universe of meaning, and in the interest of time, I'm going to go through a bunch of other things. I have an excerpt here, but I'm not going to read it. But it demonstrates my excerpt that. Actually, my protagonist is he is emotional. He does talk in an idiosyncratic way, and and you see his vulnerabilities, etc., etc. But it's done. It's about Africa. It's basically the way the agents look at it is, can I sell this material for a high price that's worth my working with it? And so there's not a lot of room for literary fiction, especially about ethnographic type of subjects. So, but fiction is, nonetheless, you can find, I eventually found the publisher for it, you can find ways to publish it, and it does reach an audience. It's a good way of telling a story. So what are the contributions of the ethnographic self, or the anthropological self? What do we and you might think about this in terms of your own specializations in history or Middle Eastern studies. For anthropologists, our greatest contribution is ethnography, describing how people live. That is we have a record of ethnography. That is our gift to the world, if you will. And why is ethnography a gift to the world? Well, in ethnography, we evoke place, right? So locality. So we describe a place where people live, and you certainly can do this in works of history where you can describe the the historically situated places where historical events took place. So locality, I call it sensuous description. So in sensuous description, you describe places or objects or scenes as if they are alive, as if they're alive with memory. So a building, a wall has soaked up memory. And so if you approach it as a writer, you're looking at that wall and you say, what is this wall saying to me? What memories can I feel coming out of this wall? And there are some fabulous writers who do this. One is my good friend Piers Vitebsky, who writes about Siberia. He wrote a book called The Reindeer People, where he describes Siberia in just a breathtaking, sensuous description. And you get a real sense of a group they're called the Ebony. They herd reindeer in the wilds of Siberia, and you get a real sense as a reader of what it's like to live in that circumstance, in that situation. Another one is the American writer James A.G., who wrote a fabulous book called And Now Let Us Praise Famous Men, which is about the 1930s depression in the U.S. and Alabama. And he describes how sharecroppers, their living space, and you get a sense of what they were living in, how they lived, the smells, the texture. It's really quite amazing stuff. So that's one thing. So we describe locality in ethnography. Second, there's dialogue. Really good ethnographies they describe how people talk and idiosyncratically. So this is another way of enabling the reader to understand the people that we talk to. They're real people. They're not just informants. They're real people with personalities and histories, mannerisms. So it's important to try to describe those people. And then character. What is it about a person that makes him or her memorable? What sets them apart from other people? Right? And you can say that about whether it's an ethnographic person in ethnography, but what is it about a person in sort of a historical text? What sets them apart from everyone else? What is distinct about them? Right? And how do you convey that to the reader? Maybe it's the way their face is set. Maybe it's a particular phrase that they use. Maybe it's the way they walk. So there are little sort of tricks of the trade to flesh out the character of a person, whether it's a present-day person or a historical person. And then, in ethnography at least, and I suppose you can do the same in history, you can take that and weave it into analysis. So what I like to say is I call it weaving the world. So weaving the world, you take a narrative thread, and where the narrative thread sort of implicates a point of analytical discussion, then you sort of segue into that analytical discussion. So if you have these people and you're telling their story, and then you segue into the narrative, the analytical part of it, you're not only doing narrative and you're attracting the reader's attention, making something memorable for them, but you're also being a social scientist or a historian, and you are connecting it to sort of some degree of analytical, there's some dimension of analysis there, weaving the world. So in one of the books I did called Money Has No Smell, it's about West Africans living in New York City and how they adjust to life in the Big Apple. And there are three life histories that I speak about write about in that book. But I use their stories to talk about globalization, economic restructuring, cultural alienation, informal economy. I use that to talk about trademark law. All of these things are implicated in their stories. So I use the stories and I can move into that kind of thing. So it's a way of encompassing, the narrative enables you to encompass a very complex whole in a way that connects the reader and the writer. Right? So that's important. Now in fiction, we have some of the same elements. You can use some elements in fiction in writing ethnography or writing really good narrative history, I suppose. There's place, obviously, in fiction, which is evoked. Dialogue, which is more important in fiction than in ethnography. There's character, which is character development, which is very important in fiction. But there's also in fiction plot and drama. And the key for any kind of writing that you're doing, whether it's writing a history, whether it's you're doing cultural studies, whether you're doing ethnography or fiction, the real challenge of doing any of this kind of representation is getting the reader to turn the page. Sounds simple, but it's not so simple. We live in times where we're easily distracted. People don't sit down and read a book usually in one sitting. How do you get someone? How do you hook them to connect to your story and turn the page, right? And so fiction writers use drama and plot. They say, oh, well, what's going to happen next, right? or if there's a particularly interesting character in an ethnography or in a historical narrative, same kind of thing. How do you do that to get the reader to turn the page? And in anthropology now, people are experimenting in all different kinds of genres, and these are developments of the contemporary anthropological self, extended through new platforms of representation. So there are people who do drama based on ethnographic research, and drama is maybe the most difficult. To just rely on dialogue to evoke character and place, theme, and plot is incredibly difficult. I have great admiration for people who do that. There are a number of my colleagues who have written plays and they've been produced. One of my good friends, Andrew Irving, who's at the University of Manchester, has put together a play based on, with collaboration with some theater people, based on 2 of his articles about AIDS, death, and dying in Uganda. Very powerful piece of theater that he put together. And this is just another way of transforming what we learn in the academy to a larger public, part of that scholarly obligation that I was talking about earlier. And then there is poetry, for anthropology, there's an increasing number of anthropologists who write poems. The most famous is Renato Rosaldo, who has written a book called The Day Shall He Die. It's about the death of his wife in the field. Very, very powerful stuff, where you have a compressed language in which there is incredible, it's saturated with meaning, emotion, and insight, sort of cultural and existential insight. And then there is, there are art installations. So there's a thing that goes on in the United States called the ethnographic terminalia, where the one that I was happy to review was about the archival texture of history. And it was an artist installation where how people remember and how that is a tactile kind of thing, or can be a tactile kind of thing. And it was really quite impressive to go through and see how different artists, in collaboration with anthropologists, present the tactility of history, how people remember through touching an object or listening to a voice, and how they remember the past that way. Now, I want to, am I going over my time?
Okay.
I'm okay? All right, so I want to talk about the story, and I'm going to end with the story, because I'd rather have more interchange with you folks. So I'm going to read this, so I get it right. So when I first arrived in Niamey, Niger in 1976 to begin anthropological research among the Songhay people, I took up residence in a small monk-like room at the University of Niamey's Social Science Research Institute. There I met Nigerian colleagues and arranged for my credentials to be sent to a local administrator who governed the regions where I planned to do field work. While I waited for my colleagues to make these arrangements, I spent time in the library. I could read all these books that I couldn't get in the U.S., historical texts about local societies, a really fantastic library there. So one morning, I noticed a white man sitting alone on the ledge, at the edge of the Institute grounds. And he was wearing khakis and a light blue shirt. He had blue socks. His blue socks matched the color of his shirt. There's a blue ascot tied expertly around his neck. I could never do that myself. Blue ascot around his neck. No diamond stud in his ascot. That was a good thing. The man had a round face, little hair, large penetrating blue eyes, and he smiled at me with warmth. So, hello, he said, can I help you? And I said, who the hell is this guy? I said, well, I'm a researcher here. I'm waiting for final authorization to go to the bush. And he said, are you an anthropologist? I am, I answered. He said, where are you headed? I said, Mehana. He slapped his hand on the sides. I know Mehana. I spent time there. You did? Yeah, several years ago. Curiosity finally got the best of me, and I said, my name is Paul Stoller. Can I ask you your name, monsieur? Of course, he said, smiling radiantly, I am Jean Rouche. Oh my God! Please excuse my impertinence, Monsieur Rouge. I've read all of your books and I've seen many of your films. I hope I haven't insulted you. Not at all, my friend. From now on, just call me Jean. That's the way he was. Okay, I said, a little bit flabbergasted. He asked me to sit next to him. We talked at length about Songhay religion, history, and society. By the time the lunch hour arrived, he stood up, dusted off his trousers, and extended his hand to me. I enjoyed our conversation very much. I'd rather talk with you than meet an annoying minister for lunch. He shrugged, and he winked at me, and he says, Paul, and he was channeling Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So that beautiful friendship spanned almost 30 years. And I learned a great deal from Jean Rouge. He's my mentor. And I think every scholar needs a mentor. He's a very personal and committed model of fieldwork. Has guided me as an anthropologist in Niger, where, like Jean Rouge, I learned about sorcery, witchcraft, and spirit possession. And in New York City, where I studied Nigerians adapting to cultural challenges of life in America. So by following his model, I learned that the quality of a text, the quality of what we produce, comes less from the sophistication of a particular research design, theoretical orientation, or cinematic gaze, and more from the depth and texture of the ethnographer's friendship in the field. Right? So if you have limited relationships with the people that you're dealing with, you're not going to produce a very good ethnography. Do ethnographers have a long history with the people they want to represent? Is there a deep sense of mutual respect between those who write or film and those who are depicted in those texts or in those films? For Jean Rouge and for me, these are questions that shape the quality of textual and visual ethnographic representation. So he valorized, Jean Rouge did, the ethnographic past to think about the ethnographic future. He's always oriented to the future. He's always looking at the future. In all of our conversations over a 30-year period, he always tapped into the wisdom of the Songhay and Dogon people to remember the past, to concentrate on the future. In all of these discussions, we never lost sight of the story, the narrative thread that connects past, present, and future. And so, you know, and that brings me to Tim O'Brien, the thing that I read at the beginning about stories being for eternity. There's another guy who talks about story and its importance in social relations and connecting writers and readers, Jonathan Gottschall, who says, story, sacred and profane, is perhaps the main cohering force in human life. A society is composed of fractious people with different personalities, goals, and agendas. Don't we know it? What connects us beyond our kinship ties? So, story. As John Gardner puts it, fiction is, quote, essentially serious and beneficial, a game played against chaos and death, against entropy. Story is the counterforce to social disorder, a tendency of things to fall, the tendency for things to fall apart. Story is the center without which the rest cannot hold. Right? So, you know, the Songhay like to say, Boro Sitama Nyankan Labusi, one cannot walk where there is no ground. Story is the ground for me and for Jean Rouge. So I always remember being in Paris, being at the Musée de l'Homme, where Rouge had his makeshift projection room, and he would invite me to sit in on film screenings. And so people would come and present their films in progress to the master. And he always, you know, would say, no matter, you know, very often he would say, well, where is the story, or what is the story, or how can we make the story better? What changes can you make, editing changes, or to bring forward the story? Because the way it is now, there's no connection between this film, and we can say by contrast a text, whether it's historical or ethnographic, and the audience that it's supposed to receive, right? So for, you know, he's always talking about the story, and in this day and age where we have multiple platforms, we have blogging, we have social media, we have film, you know, people on their phones, etc., etc. People coming up with the latest technological innovation to produce their scholarship. We can often lose sight of the centrality of the story about what we do and the importance of it. So in my own case, My life's path has placed me on the path of narrative. My anthropological self is I'm an anthropologist, but I'm also a writer, but I'm also, fundamentally, I'm a storyteller. So in your academic pursuits, I implore you not to forget, you don't want to forget theories. They do help us understand the social world and the self. But I also challenge you to listen and to write narratives, because stories that help us to remember these stories help us to remember what it means to be a human being in the world. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I thought just a very brief, if you want, ethnographic comment before we go on. Your story about the master sorcerer passing his craft to his son reminds me of a true story. There was an extremely important Kabbalist in the south of Israel called Rabbi Israel Chatzira, Rabbi Sali. Unfortunately, the son who was supposed to be his heir died prematurely, and the younger son, who was supposed to do something entirely different, had to step in. He moves from the university, if you want to call it, which is, the secular life, back to his father's room. He puts on his father's garb, and he listens to his father's secrets. And the last thing, he describes it, his father says to him, and before he died, my father passed on the real secret, which is the secret of his barakah. And from that moment on, I am both a rather dubious politician and a great sorcerer in the past. I think ignore my cynical comments. Our next speaker is a dear friend of mine, and a person I both admire and love, Professor Haim Hazan of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Tel Aviv University. Retired, Hazan? Retired, Haim? Yes. Just to mention a few of his books, you may know his Introduction to Anthropology, written by Universitat Stoller in Israel, but also The Limbo People, Managing Changing Old Age, The Paradoxical Community from Transmissible Old Age, Constructions and Reconstructions, and Against Hybridity, Social Impasses in a Globalizing World. He is probably one of the most important world experts in the anthropology of old age, and as I said, one of the sharpest minds around.
Thanks again. Well, I'm not going to tell you a story. I'm going to read you a bedtime story. It'll probably put you all to sleep. And it's not of the Arabian Night kind. It's not going to give you any thrill. But what I'm going to offer is an ode and elegy to the art of storytelling. And let's kick off with a few questions in the wake of Paul's captivating presentation. The questions are, what urges an ethnographer to turn from being a sorcerer's apprentice, and Paul failed to mention that he was one, a sorcerer's apprentice, to a novelist? Where is the philosopher's stone that transforms any ethnographic alloy into pure literary gold? What is the serendipitous moment that elevates a writer of culture into a storyteller that creates culture? My comments to that effect reverberate Omar's realization that in the world of sorcery, coincidence does not exist. There is a cause and an explanation to every event. The following critique of the limits and potentialities of narratology, therefore, is set to get to the bottom of the logic of that apparently unreasonable conversion from ethnography to wizardry. Let's begin at the end. The passion for making up stories unite us, ethnographers, sorcerers, and historians, in the common bond of the desire to weave the carpet of life in an almost flawless Persian craftsmanship. In this sense, we are indeed devout storytellers, or we are nothing. However, the unseemly possibility of such nothingness, namely the incapacity to spin a yarn, is just as fascinating as its opposite, the narrative imperative. For most ethnographers, the dilemma of to tell or not to tell is likened to the predicament of to be or not to be. But this inherent analogy is false, since muteness is no less telling than any uttered tale, and speechlessness is echoed in countless verbal versions of its meaning. This state of being in silence is not necessarily the resonance of oppression, as many post-colonial pundits would have it, nor is it the inevitable offshoot of a hushed protest. Rather, a dialogical impasse followed by a waning storyline could be the untoward consequence of being lost in translation, of a breach in communication between the native's point of view and the anthropologist's horizon of possible worlds of consciousness. When this happens, then, both interlocutors are rendered incommunicado, and the anthropologist among them faces self-effacement as she or he is at the risk of losing narrative as an ultimate raison d'etre. To avert such an existential stalemate, an ethnographic burial ground, the compulsively ceaseless storyteller is forced to become a conjurer, juggling the real and the unreal, the earthly and the unearthly, the natural and the supernatural, the possible and the implausible. The ringed set for performing this act of being in two worlds at once staged an alternative spectacle to disappearing dialogical spaces. This vanishing conversational turf is thus refilled and revived with the acrobatics of the fantastic and the existent, the worldly and the unworldly. This mode of articulating ethnographic text cohabits the lived in and the dreamt of, the factual and the fictional, or in today's terms, truth and post-truth. Such hybrids could be manifested in visionary accounts unfettered from conventional ethnographic accountability, such as in the literary flair imbuing anthropological text, in the fold of memoirs, in the artistic aesthetics of documentary films, in the cinema verité of Jean Rouge, or in the unpublished novel, I believe it is already published? Or
it's published.
About to be published, okay, by Paul Stoller. As very few anthropologists opt from the Wittgensteinian dictum, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, thereby reaching the impassable point of infallibility, this is the road not taken in reporting ethnographic journeys. Yet, it should be addressed and counted, and to that end, we should wind up by demonstrating how, nevertheless, silence breeds and aborts resounding ethnographic vignettes. But before that, a further elaboration of the manner by which ethnographic narratives are extended to adjacent genres is called for. The idea of literary embedded ethnography follows a long history of overlapping of limits between recording the mundane and yearning for the sublime, of being grounded in circumstance while being ensnared in mission and vision. What is the vigor behind craving for the beyond? What impulses the literally bound anthropologist to seek the harbor of literary letters? My take is that this drive is built into the fundamental anthropological situation of constantly being lodged in a dialogical deadlock, in the essential inability, albeit morally persuasive, to transmute the voice of the other to that of the researcher without doing injustice to both. As translation is forever in jeopardy of reflecting the power balance between the two narrators, with the anthropologist's master story reigning supreme, the possibility of forming a fair dialogue is a priori failed. Hence, the anthropological credo of authentic rendition of the other's voice cannot abide such innate colonialism, nor does it tolerate the residues of the native's unaccountable and untranslatable experiences. These experience leftovers of an unaccomplished translation could easily turn into a petri dish for festering unidentified new ethnographic strains. Professor Stoller, in his wisdom, detected both bugs in the anthropological program of recounting ethnography, the paternal and the excessive. And in at least two of his books, Sensuous Scholarship and The Power of the Between, he offers his sorcerer's medicines to respectively heal the ills of such deficiencies. Thus, in sensual scholarship, he shows how finely tuned attention to the silent sounds of bodies is vital to complement our audiovisual perception in a society where senseless exchanges are flown in virtual social networks. This supplementary knowledge is invaluable to reach out to the edge of ethnographic expressive repertoire of sensory feelers such as rustle, gesture, scent, tonality, mood, and sentiment. The other book, The Power of the Between, is a testimony to the true matter of the ethnographic enterprise, which is the transient third space spanning anthropological and anthropologist and native, placing them alike on an equal footing, thus decolonizing them both. The between them is a transformative territory capable of generating reversible worlds, interchangeable selves, and temporal disarray. The conjoined notion of both books spell the undoing of the act of storytelling as a stated reflection of a solitary narrator. In other words, stories must be sensed and acted and negotiated before they are spoken or written. Like places of memory in Pierre Nora's interpretation of the concept, storytelling must be alive and vibrant, or it is rendered, or they are rendered petrified. When set in disciplinarian cliches, the gist of ethnographic vitality might go amiss. The dialogical dynamic that engenders it could shrink into one monologistic voice. The ability instilled in the between, therefore, turns life course into cycle, norms into anomaly, determinacy into indeterminacy, and field into stage. It becomes a breeding ground for the emergence of non-ethnographic ways of composing experience, including that which is beyond conformist narration. This is an open-ended space that allows for uninhibited experiential experimentation. Thus, anthropologists who dwell in and on this nomadic habitat are tempted to transcend ethnography by resorting to other forms of creative writing, such as poems, plays, and novels. This productive potency of the between is contingent upon the between being a between, namely a liminal space of intermediacy, connectivity, and shareability. The social, rather than the personal, therefore, is the agent of its own deconstruction and reconstruction in texts that conflate real and fictional protagonists and plots. The Sorcerer's Burden, this is the title of Prof's novel, is no exception. And like anthropologist Hilda Cooper, for example, play A Witch in My Heart, the ethnographer cum writer draws on the knowledge of the field to scull towards the unknown by stringing fieldwork scenes into imaginary scenarios. This feeling of the void between known and knowable is not necessarily a philosophical quest, nor is it an aesthetic exercise in complementing the jigsaw picture of the reality under study. Rather, it could be construed as a theologian pilgrimage, aiming at some indestructible truism, despite the critical skepticism that plagues current anthropology. The ethnographically anchored literary venture is thus an attempt to defy the discipline while adhering to its substantive explorations. Not only does the between offer the opportunity to break down the walls of the discipline, but it compels the storyteller to conjure up a tale that could seal the nooks and crannies in the forever incomplete ethnographic edifice. To undertake such a task, cooperative effort involving invented or real storytellers is needed. Their joint work would be to tinker with the forever chinked armor of a narrated world that shields divides representations from unadulterated presentations. Such a convention of narrators summoned by the ethnographer turned writer could populate the play or novel as long as communication based on some common language is assured. What happens then when such basic rapport is missing from the interaction? Is the between under such circumstances is rendered de facto? Can a story be woven from loosely unraveled ethnographic threads? Is there a case in point that could be adduced to demonstrate such impasse? My own research into the world of the very old, for example, does not lend itself to the art of storytelling. Notwithstanding the fact that talks were conducted in one common language, Hebrew in Israel and English in England, communication was often stalled and dialogues were fractured, disjointed and incoherent, and presumably not due to the mental incapacitation of either party. In studies of the so-called Third Age, it transpires that many elderly people, like the Marranos, the forcibly converted new Christians, split their selfhood into two, with one self interacting with selves of shared destiny, while the other is geared to negotiate terms with selves alien to its world, but vital to its existence, like community workers, social workers, family members, and so on. This management of a split double selfhood is a step towards possible disengagement from social commitments. However, the oldest old, otherwise dubbed fourth age, cross this fine line. They thus abandon both circles of internal and external selfhood. The following aborted exchange attests to this selfless age. This is a kind of attempted conversation. Would you tell me your life story? There's not much to tell. Everything is disconnected. Everything happened in its own right. What do you hope for in the future? Nothing. The future is over. Could you label your life chapters? Empty, empty. All your life, all my life. This is the point where the between disappears. A no-anthropological sorcery could turn the empty pages into a life narration, suggesting cause and effect, textual sequence, and contextual backdrop. It trails neither course nor cycle. It follows neither rules nor meanings. The materials from which the knowable is fabricated are totally absent from this unaccountable account. Where there is no between, there is no sorcery, and where there is no chance of turning the unfathomable real into the fathomable unreal. Even this reversal of fortunes between the meaningless real and the tenable unreal cannot yield in an intelligible account. Neither history nor story, only unbroken silence. End of story.